Welcome, funders and environmental leaders. I'm Nina Lepke, and I'm with the Health and Environmental Funders Network. HEFN is pleased to present this webinar on wireless radiation and health. The panelists today are national and international experts who will do their best to catch everyone up on this complex environmental hazard and some recent developments that provide new opportunities for advocacy and public education. I want to note that all presentations today are based on peer-reviewed science. There's a lot that's been happening in this space on both the science and policy side. So we've scheduled this webinar for 75 minutes to get through everything and to give participants a chance to ask questions and have a discussion. I also just wanted to mention that some key definitions and acronyms will be dropped into the chat throughout the conversation, which you might find helpful. And you'll also hear some quiet bells ringing in the background that just are indicating to speakers the amount of time that they have left. Questions for funders will be reserved until the end of the conversation. And with that, I'll pass it on to Samantha.
It is a pleasure. Good day, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're located. It's a wonderful pleasure to be here with all of you. My name is Samantha Anderson, and I work with Lendri Purcell at Jonas Philanthropies. And on behalf of Lendri, who really is the dream visionary behind today's program, and her foundation, Jonas Philanthropies, we would like to thank the whole team at HEFN for their help for putting together our program today and for hosting us. So, as Nina said, there is a very large list of presenters today, and we're going to first talk about the science, and then we're going to discuss what you all need to do to feel safer about that science. And we recognize that there's a lot of information that's going to be shared, and it can feel a bit overwhelming, especially when wireless technology is such a big part of our everyday lives. So we want you to come away feeling as though, yes, there are things to worry about, but there are actionable things that we can do to mitigate that kind of exposure in our lives.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm Dr. Cindy Russell, Executive Director for Physicians for Safe Technology, and I'm here to give you a brief overview of the health effects of wireless technology. I'm a Stanford-trained physician, and I've studied environmental toxins through our local county medical association and the California Medical Association for over 25 years. I've worked on pesticides, flame retardants, bisphenol A, fracking chemicals, and other toxic exposures that affect our health. Most recently, I've been working on wireless technology. We're using more and more wireless devices, thus we're increasingly exposed to microwave radio frequency radiation, which surrounds us now on all sides. Physicians are becoming more concerned about the health effects of this technology, and in the last 2 years, I've spoken at 3 physician conferences for continuing medical education on the health effects of wireless technology. How did I become interested in this topic? Well, when I learned of a proposal to place a cell tower in my daughter's school 10 years ago, I dove into the research, and I found out there were valid health concerns, and it was not such a good idea to put a cell tower in a school setting. What I also learned was that wireless radiation passes through our bodies in all organisms. Wireless radiation is absorbed by anything that contains water, and we're 70% water. Note, you can't cook dry rice in a microwave oven. Wireless radiation can interfere with our cellular biological processes that are not heat-related. And also, we get exposed to a mix of artificial pulsed electromagnetic radiation frequencies at the same time. And this is very similar to the mix of chemical toxins that we're regularly exposed to, and we cannot hear, see, or taste. And we're also electrical beings. Our brain, heart, nervous system, and endocrine system work through tiny electrical impulses that affect our molecules and membranes. It makes sense that electromagnetic radiation could harm us. There are 7 decades of military and scientific studies that indicate wireless technology is biologically active and acts as an environmental and human toxin. And the effects are variable and they're nonlinear. There are differences in our genetics, our nutrition, toxic exposures that produce differences in how our bodies and our biology react to these wireless exposures. Is there a biologic mechanism of harm? People ask. Well, yes, it's oxidation. And the mechanism of toxicity of wireless frequencies is similar to that of many chemical toxins we're exposed to, including ionizing radiation. It is oxidation. 261 studies show that wireless radiation causes oxidative stress, which in turn causes inflammation. We know oxidative stress damages DNA, lipids, proteins, and membranes. Oxidative stress causes injury to nerve cells, heart cells, the immune system, the reproductive system, and the nervous system. Oxidative stress leads to inflammation and a host of chronic human diseases we commonly see now. There are both acute and long-term health effects, and acute effects occur shortly after exposure to a wireless device or a nearby cell tower. It's like an allergy. Those who are sensitive experience neurologic symptoms such as headaches, nausea, dizziness, irritability, memory loss, heart palpitations, insomnia, and fatigue. It's estimated that up to 30% of people are mildly electrosensitive, up to 5% of people have moderate symptoms, and 0.65% of the population are unable to work or be around wireless devices at all, and that adds up to about 2 million Americans. We know occupational exposure to military radar, which is the same type of telecommunications we use now, causes these same neurologic symptoms. Firefighters developed many of these symptoms when cell towers were placed on or near their fire stations, and this led the International Association of Firefighters to develop a policy resolution in 2004 to successfully fight cell towers on fire stations. This is now codified in 2 California telecom bills, AB 57 and AB 537, that exempt fire stations from having cell towers due to health effects on firefighters. You may have heard about the Havana syndrome. There are reports of incapacitating neurologic symptoms that were experienced in American and Canadian government officials stationed in Cuba in 2016, as well as China in 2018. More recently, similar attacks have been reported in Austria and Arlington, Virginia. A National Academy of Sciences report in 2020 concluded the symptoms are due to pulsed microwave radiation. The U.S. civilians can get Havana syndrome too. This occurs when cell towers are placed close to homes or if someone is electrosensitive and near wireless devices. I'm working with a town back east fighting a cell tower placed without proper notification. When the cell tower was turned on, 17 people living in the neighborhood near the cell tower developed the same neurologic symptoms. People are now moving out and deciding to sell their homes if they can. The long-term effects of a toxin, be it wireless technology or chemicals, occurs over time because the biologic damage is cumulative. Studies show that wireless radiation is associated with cancer, reproductive failure, including miscarriage, neurologic harm such as ADHD, cognitive decline, and memory impairment. Dr. Lee, a Kaiser physician and researcher, studied 913 pregnant women and measured everyday exposures to electromagnetic radiation. And they found a 3-fold increase in miscarriage in the highest tier of everyday exposures. It was an excellent study and without anyone refuting the results of the methodology. A review of 8 of 10 studies showed that neurobehavioral symptoms or cancer occurred in populations living in distances less than 500 meters or about 1,640 feet from cell tower base stations. A 10-year study of the 3rd largest city in Brazil by the health department showed that within 1,600 feet of a cell tower, the rate of cancer increased by up to 17-fold, and those power density readings were well within the FCC guidelines. Egger looked at a town in Bavaria and published his findings that showed a 3-fold increase in malignancies if you lived 5 years near a cell tower that was within 400 meters or about 1,200 feet. Mayo in 2018 published his research examining the changes in neurologic function of students in 2 schools that had adjacent cell towers. One tower had 5 times higher power density, but all within the FCC guidelines. He showed significant cognitive decline in the students near the higher powered cell tower after 2 years. Wildlife and insects are even more sensitive than we are and also adversely affected by cell towers. The FCC standards are outdated. They're based on short-term thermal heating, not on long-term biological effects. The FCC is being sued for its failure to reevaluate the health effects of wireless radio frequency radiation. We're still in a large experiment. We want to reap the benefits of technology while preserving human health and environmental health and well-being. Let's take precautions. Thank you.
Michael is the co-founder of Commonweal and co-creator of the Collaborative on Health and the Environment. And Michael, over to you.
Thank you so much, Samantha. And I'm just honored to be here. I'm going to be very brief. I really am grateful that I had the idea of creating with a couple of friends the Che EMF listserv. And I'm so grateful it's been useful to the field. I'm not an expert. I want to hear from them. The bottom line is this is an immense threat. And the question that I hold is whether we're going to create the level of philanthropic support and advocacy and science combined that we see in other developed fields, like the chemical field. It's amazing what all of you have done. Lendri has been a true leader in the philanthropic effort. Catherine Dodd and Joel Moskowitz and all of you here are people I admire deeply. So I'm just glad to listen. Thank you very much, Samantha.
Okay, thank you, Michael. So we're going to start our conversation today talking about the science and what is the problem and what is there science behind the problem of wireless radiation. And we have Linda Birnbaum here with us. Linda is a board-certified toxicologist and served as the director of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences of the National Institutes of Health and the National Toxicology Program, NTP, from 2009 to 2019. And she will address the lack of robust review or risk assessment by many federal agencies on the science behind wireless radiation. So, Dr. Birnbaum, thank you.
Thank you, Samantha, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you are. I think we've heard a great kind of brief overview from Dr. Russell about some of the effects. So there may be a little bit of repetition on what I'm going to tell you, but I think it's really time to focus on technology and telecommunications infrastructure through an environmental health lens. The science is sufficient now to trigger protective public health policy in order to reduce environmental exposures to wireless radio frequency radiation. We're really in the middle of a paradigm shift when it comes to understanding the health impacts of RFR. Originally, it was thought it was safe because it's non-iodizing. It lacks the intense energy of X-rays or gamma rays, which really directly damage DNA and can lead to cancer. For decades, RFR was considered to have only one main problem. It can overheat tissue at a very high power, like a microwave heats up food. But as cell phones are very low powered, the long-held assumption had been that there was little possibility of harm. Aware back in 1966 that the limits that limited the underpinning of solid data regarding long-term health effects, in 1999, the FDA requested large-scale studies by the National Toxicology Program, which is considered the organization that's the gold standard for toxicology testing. And we should test it in a similar way to that we test new chemicals or drugs. Now, every agent known to cause cancer in humans will also produce cancer in animals if it's adequately tested. And the NTP has conducted over 600 two-year bioassays. Overall, the NTP findings demonstrate the potential for RFR to cause cancer in humans. The independent peer review of the entire proceedings, which was carried out by toxicologists, pathologists, and statisticians, independent of my NTP staff, and it was conducted in March of 2018, concluded that there was clear evidence of cancer with respect to schwannomas of the heart in male rats, which is very similar to a schwannoma of the acoustic nerve, really, in people. And also some evidence of cancer of the, with respect to gliomas, and these were in the male rats. In addition, the review documented DNA damage in multiple organs, along with preneoplastic lesions in both cardiac and brain tissue. Now, as already said, the tumor type, the schwannomas, have also been found in studies on people, as have glioblastomas in people who have heavy use of cell phones. Additionally, in our rodent studies, we found heart damage and in the hearts of our animals and DNA damage, despite the fact that the animals were carefully exposed at levels of RFR that did not heat the tissues. More recently, the Ramazzini Institute, which is a nonprofit institute, private institute in Italy, conducted studies using lower exposures than the NTP did that were very similar to cell tower emissions, and they found the same tumors that the NTP did. So both the NTP and the Ramazzini studies, alongside the human data, provide strong evidence of the potential for radiofrequency radiation to cause cancer in people. These landmark studies should have triggered a quantitative risk assessment by US health agencies. Instead, the FDA rejected the NTP conclusions and unfounded criticisms were leveled at the finding in order to downplay their significance. The 1996 FCC limits are primarily based on protecting people from heating effects. The NTP study was designed to test the assumption underpinning those FCC limits, that heating was the only harm from exposure. However, the carefully controlled NTP studies found DNA damage and tumors at RFR levels that were not thermally relevant, indicating that this assumption of safety is no longer accurate. Recently, the Circuit Court in Washington, D.C. has highlighted that there has been no robust review of the FCC's regulations, nor a review of the full body of science by any U.S. health or safety agency for decades. There's a mounting body of science indicating impacts to the brain, reproduction, oxidative stress, and there are studies showing synergistic effects when ionizing radiation is combined with other toxic exposures. Protective policy is needed today. We really don't need more science to know that we should be reducing exposures. The DC court ruling confirms that the FCC's 1996 wireless exposure limits lack a robust scientific foundation. I have joined with other scientists in a letter to President Biden and Congress, calling on them to promote policy that will reduce public exposures to wireless radiation and to engage the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine in a robust research and policy review to ensure that the US develops more protective regulations for people, wildlife, and for the natural environment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Birnbaum. We are blessed to have Dr. Uche with us. She is an environmental working group scientist and recently published findings, which she's going to talk more about, in a peer-reviewed journal, Environmental Health, which refute the 1996 FCC safety guidelines that are unfortunately still in use today. So, Uloma, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Samantha. First of all, I would like to highlight, what prompted the EWG study that was published in the peer-reviewed journal, Environmental Health. Just like the previous speakers have highlighted, the current FCC exposure standard for radiofrequency radiation is outdated. It was set in 1996. And that standard was based on studies from the 1970s and 1980s, that found behavioral changes in animals that were exposed to radiofrequency radiation. With the latest science, linking radiofrequency radiation exposure to adverse health impacts, such as the increased risk of cancers, neurological disorders, developmental disorders, and so on. We expect the FCC would update its standard, but that never happened. So EWG now decided to review the latest evidence by using incident data from the 2018 National Toxicology Program study to estimate an exposure limit that would adequately protect children and adults against adverse impacts associated with radiofrequency radiation exposure. Just like Dr. Birnbaum rightly said, the NTP study is one of the largest long-term studies on the health effects of radiofrequency radiation exposure. And its data is a valuable resource, for the development of health-based guidelines for radiofrequency radiation exposures in people. So applying the same methodology developed by the EPA to assess human health risks arising from toxic chemical exposures to radiofrequency radiation, the results of analysis suggested an exposure guideline for children that is 200 to 400 times lower than the current FCC whole body exposure limit of 0.08 watts per kilogram. For the adults, that should be 20 to 40 times lower than the FCC limit. So based on our analysis, EWG recommends that the FCC, adjust its outdated health standard for wireless radiation with the latest science to protect the general population, especially children. Finally, with advanced technological changes and substantial evidence linking radiofrequency radiation exposure to adverse impact, simple steps, to reduce our exposure are strongly encouraged. For example, keeping wireless devices away from your body and relying more on wired internet access to reduce our radiofrequency radiation exposure. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. We're now going to hear from Dr. Joel Moskowitz, who is the director of the Center for Family and Community Health at the School of Public Health at the University of California, Berkeley.
Thanks, Samantha. Today, I'm going to cover some highlights from a webinar that the Center for Occupational and Environmental Health has invited me to present next week. And if you would like to learn more about the science, I invite you to register for this free webinar on November 3rd using the link in this slide, the next slide, actually. Please, the next slide. Also see my website, saferemr.com. Somebody can probably put that in the chat, the link. They have 500, they can register up to 500 people for this webinar. Next slide, please. I'm going to go over some background, so some of this will be repetitive. The electromagnetic spectrum includes all types of electromagnetic fields arrayed by the frequency or length of the waves. On the far right are the highest frequency and smallest waves, which are considered ionizing, for example, X-rays. This radiation has sufficient energy to knock electrons out of their orbits, causing an atom to become charged or ionized, which can directly cause chemical changes and DNA damage. Ionizing radiation has been considered cancer-producing or carcinogenic since the 1930s. On the far left are extremely low frequency waves that oscillate up to 3,000 cycles per second, known as hertz. These waves can produce strong magnetic fields. Radio waves occur at higher frequencies, and the highest frequency radio waves are called microwaves. Cell phones and cordless phones are two-way radios that transmit microwaves. Cell phones can emit up to 2 watts of power. In contrast, a microwave oven can emit 1,000 watts. Whereas an oven has sufficient power to significantly heat tissue, wireless phones do not, except perhaps when held directly next to the body. Along with cell towers, wireless devices emit microwaves that are modulated and/or pulsed to encode voice and data. Also, the systems that power these devices emit low frequency electromagnetic fields, also called EMF. A smartphone typically has 4 or 5 different types of microwave transmitters, including 2 or 3 different cellular technologies, along with Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Some transmitters operate at multiple frequencies, and some can operate simultaneously with others, exposing users to a complex mixture of radiation. In 1996, the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, adopted exposure guidelines that limit the intensity of exposure to radiofrequency radiation. These guidelines, which were recently reaffirmed by the FCC, were designed to prevent significant heating of tissue from short-term exposure to radiofrequency radiation, so-called thermal effects. This year, in response to a lawsuit filed by health and environmental groups and wireless safety advocates, the DC Federal Appeals Court ruled that the FCC must consider the evidence that was submitted to the agency before it can reaffirm its obsolete 1996 exposure limits to ensure that the limits are adequate to protect human health. These exposure limits, however, were not designed to protect us from the effects of long-term exposure to low-intensity radiofrequency radiation. The crux of the health and safety problem we face today was stated by the FDA in 1999. The FCC regulations are, quote, based on protection from acute injury from thermal effects of radiofrequency radiation exposure and may not be protective against any non-thermal effects of chronic exposure. Next slide, please. Dr. Henry Lai, Professor Emeritus, University of Washington, former editor of the journal Electromagnetic Biology and Medicine, has compiled research summaries on the biologic effects of EMF exposure since 1990. He has found that the preponderance of evidence published in peer-reviewed journals indicates that wireless radiation is harmful. In 3/4 of 944 biologic studies, wireless radiation produced significant harmful effects, including oxidative stress and free radical generation, genetic effects, and DNA damage and neurological disorders. Many of these studies employed non-thermal exposures. In 2011, next slide, please. In 2011, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, the IARC, convened 33 scientists from 14 nations to review the research on radiofrequency radiation and cancer. Based upon their review of the science, these experts classified radiofrequency radiation as, quote, possibly carcinogenic to humans, unquote, noting an increased risk of glioma, the most common malignant brain cancer among cell phone users. They also noted increased risk of acoustic neuroma, a non-malignant brain tumor. Since 2011, hundreds of studies have found harmful biologic and health effects, including DNA damage and cancer. In 2019, the IARC convened an advisory group of 29 scientists from 18 countries to prioritize agents to be reviewed. These scientists recommended that radiofrequency radiation be re-reviewed by 2024. Many scientists believe the IARC will reclassify this environmental toxin as probably carcinogenic or carcinogenic to humans. Next slide, please. Last year, my colleagues and I published a research review that examined the association between cell phone use and tumor risk. This study updated our 2009 review. The results were similar, but based on twice as many case control studies. The bottom line is that 1,000 or more hours of call time in a cell phone was associated with a 60% increased risk of tumors, which is about 17 minutes per day over a 10-year period. Next slide, please. Epidemiologic research, that's human research, suggests the following additional health risks from cell phone use. Increased tumor risk in other anatomic sites, including the thyroid, parotid, and pituitary glands, and the female breast. Evidence for sperm damage and reduced fertility in males. Increased incidence of miscarriage and preterm births in females, and increased incidence of headaches, hearing problems, impaired memory, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder from prenatal and early childhood exposures to cell phone radiation. It is estimated about 1 to 13% of the population suffer from electrohypersensitivity, EHS, and environmental intolerance, which may cause headaches, memory impairment, fatigue, insomnia, tinnitus or ringing of the ears, heart palpitations, and other symptoms. See my website, saferemr.com, for the scientific evidence related to these human risks. Next slide, please. Although many biologic studies have reported adverse effects from exposure to microwave radiation at intensities comparable to cell tower exposures, few human epidemiologic studies of cell tower radiation have been conducted. A 2010 review by Karana and colleagues summarized 10 studies with evidence of health effects. 6 found evidence of increased neurobehavioral symptoms in people who resided within 500 meters of a cell tower. 2 studies reported increased cancer incidence. Children are likely at greatest risk for neurobehavioral symptoms. Since 2015, 7 studies have reported neurobehavioral effects in children exposed to greater levels of cell tower radiation. Next slide, please. This year, the journal Reviews on Environmental Health published a 150-page monograph in 3 parts, which examines the effects of non-ionizing EMF, including wireless radiation, on flora and fauna. These papers cite more than 1,200 references. The authors concluded that current levels of EMF exposure have numerous deleterious effects on many species of flora and fauna. You can see here the types of effects that they found and the species that they found them in. This is a pretty extensive review, major contribution to the literature. Next slide, please. In 2015, the International EMF Scientist Appeal was submitted to the World Health Organization. It was signed by almost 200 scientists. All had published peer-reviewed research on EMF and biology or health. The petition summarizes the scientific basis for the appeal, calls for stronger exposure limits, and makes policy recommendations. Currently, more than 240 EMF scientists in 44 nations have signed this petition. We have published over 2,000 papers on EMF in professional journals. I recommend you check out the appeals website, emfscientist.org. Next slide, please. The 5G appeal, which calls for a moratorium on the rollout of 5G, has been signed by more than 400 scientists and medical doctors in over 40 nations. What is 5G, and why are many scientists and physicians concerned about its rollout, along with much of the public around the world? With the 5th generation of cellular technology known as 5G, cell phones and cell towers employ lower and higher frequency microwaves than previously used. Also, for the first time, this technology employs millimeter waves, which are very high frequency microwaves. Millimeter waves behave differently than microwaves. Although they can move large amounts of data at high rates with short lags between transmissions, they travel by line of sight, and the signals are blocked by building materials and foliage. Thus, the telecom industry must install hundreds of thousands of small cell towers to deploy this technology. The current estimate by the industry is they need 800,000 more cell towers. The antennas can be as small as a few millimeters, and the arrays may consist of hundreds of antenna elements. These massive multiple input, multiple output antennas allow the use of narrow beams that can target 5G cell phone users. Millimeter wave radiation is largely absorbed in the skin, the sweat glands, the peripheral nerves, the eyes, and the testes. These waves can induce or inhibit cell death, enhance or suppress cell proliferation, inhibit cell cycle progression, and may alter structural and functional properties of membranes. The radiation can cause hypersensitivity and biochemical alterations in the immune and circulatory systems, the heart, liver, brain, and kidneys. It can harm insects and promote the growth of drug-resistant pathogens. Although there are hundreds of millimeter wave studies, no peer-reviewed studies have been published on the effects of exposure to 5G radiation. Furthermore, due to the paucity of research funding, there are only about a dozen short-term effect studies for 4G, a technology that's been in use for a decade. As Senator Richard Blumenthal charged in a US Senate hearing 2 years ago, we are quote unquote flying blind regarding the safety of this technology. Next slide, please. Media coverage plays a large role in widespread ignorance and skepticism about the harmfulness of wireless radiation. Although media bias is a complex issue, it is important to understand because it shapes public opinion. Having studied media coverage of wireless radiation research since 2009, in my opinion, the mainstream media have failed to report many important developments. We have evidence that the telecom industry has been wargaming the science and has captured key health and regulatory agencies in the US and other countries. When the media report the research, they usually promote the government narrative, which dismisses or downplays the health risks. The media have conflicts of interest due to telecom industry advertising, which will amount to $18.7 billion worldwide this year. Furthermore, several major news sources, including the New York Times and Washington Post, have partnerships with industry to become early adopters of 5G. Next slide, please. In my opinion, we are guinea pigs in a massive technological experiment that threatens our health. Our government must fund the research needed to determine a safe level of wireless radiation exposure and strengthen the FCC's radio frequency exposure limits. In the meantime, the government should impose a moratorium on technologies that increase our wireless radiation exposure, especially to new forms of wireless radiation like 5G. Final slide is my contact information. If you want more information, I would encourage you to register for the webinar I'm doing next week for the Center for Occupational and Environmental Health if you want to learn more about this, or see my website, saferemr.com. Thank you.
So we're now going to turn the conversation over to Theodora Scarato. Theodora is the executive director of the Environmental Health Trust, and she is going to highlight the recent court victory that the Environmental Health Trust was behind in the context of the FCC and the lack of health safety guidelines and regulations.
So in 2019, the FCC made a decision not to update the wireless radiation limits that everyone has been talking about. These limits, as discussed, are based on heating as the only harm, didn't address children, prenatal impacts, the real world use of our devices. We use devices touching our body, and the way our FCC limits are set up, they actually test devices at a distance from the body. Phones are not tested on the body, in your bra, in your pants pocket, as most people use them. So the decision on August 13th was, after reviewing, it's far more than 10,000 pages of evidence, that the decision not to update those limits, the FCC said there is no reason that we need to change these 1996 limits. And that was deemed arbitrary and capricious because the FCC did not show evidence of properly examining the non-cancer harms, such as long-term exposure, children's vulnerability, the testimony. There were over about 200 documents of people who've been injured by wireless radiation, impacts to the developing brain, and there was a complete failure to address environmental effects. In addition, the court noted that the medical recommendations, such as those by the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Council of Europe, cities of Boston and Philadelphia, and there was many appeals by physicians, which were ignored in the response of the FCC. In addition, there was extensive science showing impacts to the environment, as has been discussed, particular study on how radio frequency radiation injures trees around mobile phone base stations, impacts to insects like bees, and that was all ignored by the FCC. I think one of the most important pieces to the court determination into this case is that there wasn't anything on the record that showed there had been a systematic review of all of the science by any US health or safety agency. We all assume that our federal agencies are looking out for us and they're regularly monitoring the science and making sure that it's safe for our families and for our environment, our natural environment. But in fact, the EPA, the National Cancer Institute, the Department of Labor, and the NTP several years ago did file very short letters, all of them, with basically saying, we're glad that you're doing this, but they didn't offer an opinion. Now, the Department of Labor actually told the FCC to contact the National Toxicology Program, which was doing this research that Dr. Linda Birnbaum talked about on effects at non-thermal levels. And we don't see evidence or on the record that actually the FCC did reach out and request on that. The ruling stated, really noted the silence of these health agencies, that the silence of expert agencies does not constitute a reasoned explanation for the commission's decision. Silence does not indicate whether the expert agencies made any determination or whether they considered any of the evidence in the record. And this is kind of a, because we all assume, or the public assumes, that our federal government health agencies are looking out for us, the reality is that the EPA was defunded back in 1996 after many years of being defunded. And the FDA can't seem to clarify exactly what it's doing. All it has is a a literature review and a cursory statement, and they haven't or have shown no evidence of a proper science-based systematic review with a risk assessment. The court order to the FCC was that and the mandate just happened October 5th. So several weeks after the court ruling was the official mandate. The FCC has not appealed, that they need to provide a reasoned explanation for their decision to retain their testing procedures where they keep phones and devices not in body contact, and even how they test, the metrics that they use, everything about their testing procedure is absolutely outdated and based on heating is the only harm. So the court ordered the FCC to explain that better, and also to address the effects of radiofrequency radiation on children, the health impacts of long-term exposure, the ubiquity of wireless devices that have occurred since the commission last updated its guidelines, which would be 1996, and to address the radiofrequency, the impacts to the environment. So we are, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing right now because there are some really important next steps in that regard, but quite briefly, and on our website at ehtrust.org, we have all of this. Many other countries have moved forward with far more transparency. They are monitoring, they have labeling, they have banned advertisements for children for cell phones. And this is just a little map showing a bunch of different laws. Berkeley, California's law that'll inform people that phones aren't supposed to be next to the body, unfortunately. And that is a whole other bucket, which you can learn about on our website or on Dr. Moskowitz or Physicians for Safe Technology, of course. That was not implemented due to the wireless industry lawsuit and to the FCC. The FCC's action that we actually took action about rendered it not being implemented. In Belgium, there's a ban on cell phones designed for children. These France and French Polynesia also have public education campaigns and have banned the sale of cell phones for children. This is the back of a bus in Cyprus, where the Cyprus Committee on the Environment and Children's Health, in collaboration with the Department of Health, the Commissioner of the Environment. Okay, is that my end? Okay, I just want to say, can I just say super quick that the next steps are that we need to have a refresh to the record, and we are calling on the FCC to do that so that we can get all the science from the last 2 years, including the Environmental Working Group paper and the National Toxicology Program paper on genotoxicity in the record. Dr. Birnbaum talked about the other actions that we're asking for, and we need protective public policy now. And if you're interested in impact to energy consumption, which will increase due to the densification of cell towers and all of these wireless devices, we have information on that at Environmental Health Trust as well, including impacts to trees. Thank you.
Thank you, Theodora. That was wonderful. Very important information, and thank you for sharing. We're going to switch the order slightly, and Sharon Buccino from, I believe I'm pronouncing that right, correct me if I didn't, Senior Director, Lands Nature Program from the NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council, is going to speak next.
Great, and thank you, Theodora. My name's Sharon Buccino. I work as a senior attorney at NRDC, and I'm just going to give a quick overview of a couple of the key legal principles that affect the authorization of wireless services and the construction of the networks needed to provide these services. And I'm going to take the case, which Theodora just talked about, and put it in a little bit broader legal context so we can start to think about the leverage that exists in the law to address some of these issues. So as an environmental lawyer, I've traditionally worked with federal agencies like Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of the Interior, but over the past few years, I've come to know the inner workings and idiosyncrasies of the Federal Communications Commission. As we've heard, it is the FCC that controls the use of the electromagnetic spectrum for the provision of wireless services. And with this control also comes responsibility, and it's a responsibility that includes the duty to inform as well as protect the public from the health impacts of radio frequency radiation. And this duty to inform and protect flows from two different federal laws, the National Environmental Policy Act, known as NEPA, and the Telecommunications Act of 1996. So I'll start with NEPA. It requires federal agencies to analyze the environmental impacts of its proposed action and share these impacts with the public. When analyzing environmental impacts, NEPA requires an agency to consider the natural and physical environment and the relationship of people with the environment. So environment and environmental effects has been interpreted very broadly by the courts. It includes ecological impacts, it includes health impacts, and it also includes social and economic impacts. So the FCC first established its radio frequency exposure guidelines in response to its obligations under NEPA. The commission recognized that it could not meet what NEPA required of it to analyze the environmental impacts of its action when authorizing use of the spectrum without understanding the potential biological effects of radio frequency radiation. But that brings me to the Telecommunications Act, passed in 1996. So NEPA passed in 1970, but then we have the Telecommunications Act of 1996. And this is where the duty to actually protect comes from. And as wireless communication was expanding, Congress fundamentally changed the legal framework governing telecommunications when it enacted the Telecommunications Act of 1996. What it most significantly, what it did, and it was designed to accelerate wireless communication, it concentrated regulatory authority over environmental effects of RF radiation in the FCC. And the act explicitly prohibits state and local regulation of wireless facilities based on frequency emissions, so long as the facilities comply with FCC regulations concerning such emissions. So that's why where these standards are set and why the Environmental Health Trust litigation was so important, given the limitations on what local governments can do, what the FCC does and doesn't do to address environmental protection becomes critically important. One other key fact from the past is that the same year that Congress passed the Telecommunications Act of 1996, Congress limited the role of the Environmental Protection Agency, and it buried in the appropriations bill for EPA that year language that explicitly said EPA shall not engage in EMF activities, and they haven't since then. So I want to address one additional court case an NRDC was involved in addition to the case that Theodora mentioned. And it was a couple years before the most recent DC Circuit decision. But in 2019, NRDC joined, there were 16 Indian nations that were also in this lawsuit. It challenged the FCC's decision to eliminate review of impacts of EMF radiation on the environment, as well as on cultural and historic resources. So the Federal Court of Appeals in DC, the DC Circuit, found that the FCC had acted in an arbitrary and capricious manner, and they invalidated the FCC's action. So as a result, the FCC still has to conduct environmental review under the National Environmental Policy Act. So what does this mean in practice? Just a couple things real quickly. First, the FCC cannot issue a license to use the electromagnetic spectrum without evaluating the environmental impacts of such use. And second, they can't authorize the construction of cell towers or other infrastructure to provide wireless services without evaluating those environmental impacts. The problem is, I'll finish up here real quickly. is that the FCC has turned over this compliance with environmental review to the companies themselves. The citizens can petition, local governments can request the information about the environmental impacts. Citizens can petition for that, but there still is quite a bit of work for lawyers and scientists and advocates to ensure that actually the FCC is meeting the obligations that Congress has put on it. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, in the interest of time, I think Doug Wood, who is the co-founder of Americans for Responsible Technology and Grassroots Environmental Education. He is going to speak, but he only has a couple of minutes. So over to you quickly, Doug.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I'm really honored to be on this panel with so many colleagues for whom I have great respect. I am substituting for Patty today. We change places frequently because she had a previous speaking engagement and sends her apologies and best wishes to everybody. We were asked to speak today about legislation at the local, state, and federal level, and also about our work on RF radiation in schools. So first, I'll talk about the legislation. Most legislation on this issue centers around that provision in the 1996 Telecommunications Act that says that no local authority can deny a permit for a wireless antenna based on environmental concerns, as Sharon just was talking about. So to be clear, you cannot deny a small cell application based on health concerns. So this, combined with the push by telecoms to deploy their new small cell and 5G technology by installing more than 1 million new antennas, many of which will be located close to homes and schools where people will be involuntarily exposed 24/7, sets the stage for local action. Over the past few years, the FCC, which has been called the most captured agency in Washington by the Center for Ethics at Harvard University, has been slowly tightening the regulations on what local officials can do to control this deployment. Telecoms are bullying local officials and threatening lawsuits, claiming that local authorities cannot deny their applications for 5G antennas. This is not true. Local codes are the best defense against unfettered deployment of 5G, and provisions such as a requirement for liability insurance for health claims, or a random independent testing of emissions, especially for co-located equipment, or proof that all non-residential locations have been evaluated and found to be insufficient. Those kinds of provisions have slowed or stopped deployment in some communities. These are legal and logical things that any town or city can insist on, and we have language recommendations and sample codes in the toolkit on our website, which is americansforresponsibletech.org. At the state level, legislation written and promoted by the American Legislative Exchange Council, that's ALEC, sponsored in part by the Koch brothers, has been making its way into state legislatures. Some states have adopted the language in its entirety. In other states like California, it's being broken into small pieces, trying to sneak through that way. We were happy to play a role in coordinating the efforts of advocates and organizations in California to convince the governor to veto one recent bill that would have further limited local control and stymied efforts to control the deployment of 5G. At the federal level, we are continuing to monitor legislation that includes funding for 5G or language that limits local control. But as you know, Washington is a pretty unpredictable place, and the telecom lobby is extremely powerful and extremely generous with campaign contributions. Nevertheless, we continue to keep members and their staff aware of developing science regarding wireless technology. We have few champions in Congress, but Richard Blumenthal, the senator from Connecticut, has been very helpful in articulating his concern, especially in regard to the FCC's negligence on health issues. Regarding our work in schools, the cumulative amount of RF radiation that's emitted by tablets, laptops, routers, and access points in modern school classrooms can be quite high. And like many environmental exposures, children are affected in unique ways, and some of those ways are quite severe. The Tech Safe Schools program is built on a legal foundation of fiduciary responsibility, which all school administrators have for the children under their care. We believe that every administrator has a legal duty of care to become informed about the levels of RF radiation in their classrooms and to take whatever action may be required to reduce or eliminate it. Tech Safe Schools on the web at techsafeschools.org includes the detailed legal case for liability, a series of steps that schools can take to reduce exposure in classrooms by up to 90% without affecting anything. A link to our digest of hundreds of independent studies demonstrating biological harm, and a parent advocate program to help parents encourage their schools to take action on that issue. Again, all on the web at techsafeschools.org. The recent FCC court decision has been really helpful to this effort, as the court made clear that the FCC's current human exposure guidelines are not based on the latest science. Wireless equipment manufacturers and school administrators tend to hide behind the skirts of the FCC, claiming that all their equipment meets those outdated FCC guidelines, and that excuse no longer works. Thank you, EHT. Thank you, everybody else who participated in that lawsuit. I'm sorry I won't be able to stay on the call today. I do have another call. I'm supposed to be on at 2 o'clock, so I'm not too late. I'm sure they'll forgive me, but please, I encourage everybody to reach out to Patty and me and to learn more about our programs, or we're happy to field any questions that you have. And there you go, 5 minutes. You didn't have to ring your bell.
All right, terrific. Thanks so much, and thank you for all of your work. Larry Ortega is our last speaker on the presentation side, and then we'll hear from Lendri, Purcell, and Peter Sullivan. So Larry is the founder of Community Union in Pomona, California, where he is working with local officials, Communication Workers of America, and the community college to provide fiber to the premises. So Larry, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. And I'm extremely honored to be a part of this panel, and very pleased that I'm going to be able to share some of the information, the work that we're doing. I was one of those organizations that Doug was talking about that is working with in California, where we were successful in garnering the veto from the governor and the work that we had done. I've been doing this work, bringing people to technology and for improved quality of life, getting them access to online resources since 1993. So before there was even a digital divide, that's the work that I had been doing. And my whole work has been trying to get community to access these online resources. And what we found, a lot what Doug was saying about the captured regulatory agencies, and I don't think this has been said yet, but the companies, the incumbent providers, have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders to maximize profit. So that whole initiative has never been buttressed against like health issues or consumer issues. It's always been about profit. And what these companies are doing now is they're using the whole pandemic, what happened with the pandemic in California, about 2 million kids weren't able to connect online. And so what the incumbent providers did, although they are the source of the problem, is they went, give us more deference, give us more deregulation, and we promise we'll close the digital divide. Well, I've been in this game since 1993, and the promises of the telecommunication industry are nothing but air. They never deliver what they say they're going to deliver. And now they're using 5G as an excuse. And I'm just going to say a couple of things on 5G is that, first of all, many of our families that live in the digital divide cannot afford a $1,300 device to buy 5G to begin with. They're not going to be able to afford the plans. So that by itself, I mean, that's just a myth. It's just a flat out lie, and it's not going to happen. And in fact, we have information from some of our other colleagues that the incumbent providers are not even planning to deliver 5G in some of our lower income neighborhoods. And so that's the sad part about it. And I recently wrote an article that's published in Cal Matters. And one of the things that we were talking about is asking the governor rather, to investigate how do these ALEC bills, these industry bills, keep landing on his desk. And since 1993, the industry has been making promises that they were going to deliver fiber optic as an upgrade to our copper lines, as an upgrade, right? So this is stuff that they said that they were going to do. And in these promises, they were given extreme deference to do these upgrades. And instead, they found out that no one was watching the store. The FCC regulatory agencies were captured, so they didn't actually have to deliver on what these promises were about. And so we found ourselves in this huge digital divide. And right now, we are in this area where the telephone companies are asking for more deference and asking that 5G be the solution. Well, consumers never agreed that wireless technology was a good replacement for fiber optics. And also what we learned is that 5G is actually 10,000 times slower than fiber optics. So why would we give people living that need this resource, why would we give them 10,000 times slower infrastructure in their neighborhoods? It's not what we're supposed to be doing. So I just want to just say that I have a link in the chat that I'm going to be sharing that actually talks about some of the work that we're doing right now in terms of the Fiber Up Your Neighborhood program that we're bringing a testing, mapping, and survey, because our communities now have to take it upon themselves to find out where the deficiencies are, and we ourselves have to go out and map it. And so what we've done is we've engaged, and I'll just finish with this, we've engaged Communication Workers of America, we've engaged the local colleges, the local community colleges, as well as some nonprofits, as well as the workforce development centers in LA County. And we're coming together to say, okay, we gotta survey, we gotta map, and we gotta say, okay, where do we want this fiber, and demand that fiber be the infrastructure of choice as this middle mile continues to deploy out in California, and as these last mile proposals come in through some of these funding sources. Right now, we have an opportunity to close the digital divide, unlike we ever have before. And it's important that we take advantage of that now. So thank you, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Larry. All right, terrific. So we're now going to hear from Lendri Purcell, who, as I mentioned at the beginning, is the Vice President for Philanthropies. And okay, great, thanks. And we're also going to hear from Peter Sullivan, who's the founder of Pure Light. So over to you, Lendri.
Okay, can you see me? Can you hear me and see me? Great. Thank you, everybody. I'm just so grateful to be with all these brilliant minds. I just want to say two things, just so it's clear. What Larry was talking about, for folks who don't know, is there's an alternative to 5G everywhere, and that's fiber optic cables to the home or to the school or to the building. And then inside, you can use whatever you want. You can use wireless or wired technology. That's the alternative to having mini cell tower put on your lamppost. So there is a great alternative out there that's faster, safer, and more secure. And there's also pretty easy ways, unless you live in an apartment building, it's a little harder, but it is possible to really to reduce your exposure significantly at a personal level. And we'll share some links in the chat on how to do that. Things like turning your routers off at night, keeping your cell phones away from your body. I really worry about kids with this technology. I got involved in this when I was talking to an EWG scientist who said she was more worried about kids and radiation than a lot of the chemicals that they're working on. I found out about it at a time when every kid in my kid's school district was given an iPad starting in kindergarten and told that all the books would go away and everything would be done on iPads. This is what's happening in a lot of schools, and it's problematic given that the EWG study is recommending safety standards that are 200 to 400 times more stringent for children. And given that we know that the FCC is just looking at thermal effects and hasn't looked at children, I'm really concerned about our children and this technology. Also about pollinators, fertility. There's so much science out there if you look at it, and Joel's the right person to go to kind of point you to the best studies. I've worked at this at the city level with my city council to get super protective ordinance in our city, which is you can do. Americans for Responsible Technology would be the place to go to for that. I've worked at this at the state level to keep to prevent 5G from rollout from taking away cities' rights. I've worked at this at the federal level as a funder. We need more funders in this game. These few groups that are working on this are strapped. I can tell you that some of the speakers today, most of them are volunteers. They're barely getting paid. It's a pretty sad situation. When I go to other funders, when I go to environmental health groups, they usually say, we know there's something there, but it's a bandwidth issue. I just hear that bandwidth. We don't have the bandwidth. And I get it. And I get that chemical policy is where everyone's head is. But at the same time, I was sitting with Andy Egregious, a funder friend at some point, and I was saying, have you looked at cell phone issues? And he had the phone on his ear and he said, don't tell me there's a problem with that. I don't want to know. And he died of a brain tumor shortly afterwards. And I worry about our environmental health warriors who are on this technology constantly, who maybe don't know. And I worry about our children. And so I'm hoping that a few funders can join up with me. So it's not just me and Peter, and can come up with a little strategy group so we can help support the groups doing the science, doing the advocacy, doing the policy work, and come up with some strategies here. There's so much that's already been done, and there are great solutions out there to have modern technology and to keep it safer. Thank you.
Thank you, Lendri. Thank you for organizing today's conversation as well. Peter.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for organizing this. I would just follow on with Lendri that this is an area I funded other environmental health areas. I worked on mercury for more than a decade, and I was just after mercury kind of became mainstream, went from fringe to kind of international mercury treaty, you really lost your leverage as an individual funder. But at the funding EMF, really small amounts of money can make really, really big differences. I mean, we have almost billions of people being impacted 24/7, and it's constantly rising, and I would argue rising at a rate faster than chemical exposures. The good news is it can end really quickly, like as fast as pulling out the plug on a baby monitor. So I think there's a really good, just incredible social impact you can have for a small amount of time and effort. And the field has been snowballing in awareness and snowballing in credibility. And the folks who are on this call, the activists and NGOs, have just been spectacular. Again, working, some of them for decades on this issue for almost no pay, and really getting to a point where things are really getting positive finally. I know there's been a lot of banging heads against the wall, and I feel like things are finally moving, and I just want to acknowledge all that work and all that progress, and invite anyone who's interested in this and who's interested in having an impact on environmental health and children especially to come into the field and dabble and learn what you can and see what you can bring.
Great.
Just make a comment. This is Michael Lerner, and I just spoke very briefly at the beginning, but this is so profoundly important. And what Peter said about the difference between this and chemicals, that there's a way of turning it off, is really important. I have a curiosity, which is probably perilous to even mention, but because the opposition to 5G is so widespread, I wonder how easy it's going to be for the telecom industry to police the security of all these devices that they're going to place all over the place. Because I can imagine that, just as with chemicals, there may be citizen actions which will generate media coverage and deeper understanding. So it's not, I'm a great believer in obeying the law. And at the same time, when somebody is actively, promoting science-based damage to the health of children and the rest of us with lots and lots of these 5G meters, I'm just curious whether anybody addresses that possibility of peaceful civil disobedience on the meters.
Hi, I wanted to know if we have any lobbyists on our side that are representing this challenge on our behalf. Is there any lobbyist that's working on this project?
I'm happy to answer that because I've funded some personally. You can't do it through a C3. The folks who are doing the lobbying are these people that you've heard that run the nonprofits, Doug and Patty Wood. They're on the East Coast. Theodora Scarato. Deborah Davis is a scientist. She does some lobbying work. EWG does not have a lobbyist on this directly. I've personally funded some lobbying support of theirs. But no, that's the thing, is telecom has so many lobbyists and we don't have any. So that's a huge need, is C4 money to fund lobbyists. That could be done through EWG. That could be done through any of these groups that all have C4. But that's like one of the first things that we need is lobbyists on our side.
Okay.
That's
I know I'm one of the fellows for the American Nurses Association of California, and I know that this is something that we're just looking at the environment as a whole, and this is something that I'm sure that we would be able to want to work on as well. So I would love for there to be some type of collaboration amongst these organizations if possible.
That would be terrific. That would be terrific. We'll be in touch. Someone will be in touch. Thank you.
Okay.
Great.
Ellie Marks has her hand up.
And Ellie's another lobbyist and has done a lot of lobbying, again, mostly as a volunteer.
Yes, banging my head against the wall. But as Peter said, hopefully we're making progress with all of you wonderful people. Thank you so much. This was wonderful. I wanted to talk about, I think it was Linda Birnbaum that mentioned that there's been no scientific review. Now, Jeffrey Sharon of the FDA did come up with a scientific review to appease Congresswoman Eshoo a couple of years ago. And it wasn't signed and it wasn't published, but Congress seemed to fall for it. So our lobbying efforts are even more difficult. Does anyone know, or how do we rebut something like that? Is my question.
I'll just give you, Jeff really dependent on what he did. I mean, this is not atypical of some FDA reviews that they do for anything environmental, whether it's additives or contaminants in food or some with devices, that they basically ignore much of the non-guideline kind of study data, although the NTP study clearly fits the guideline, but they downrated, they just didn't consider the NTP study. There was a lot of negativity when the study was first released. I mean, we tried to brief them on it before it went through formal peer review, and they really weren't terribly interested. So all, you know, what I would do instead is stress that it needs a thorough, transparent peer review, or you know who the reviewers are, you know who's conducting the review, and so on. And that has, FDA doesn't do that for, or they certainly didn't do it in that case, and they don't always do it. So I think that's the issue. Who actually reviewed it? What did they look at? With some chemical reviews that I know they've done, they basically, as I said, threw out all this non-guideline studies of the animal studies and basically downrated any of the epidemiology.
I'll just add real quickly.
Thank you.
This is Sharon Buccino, that it's important to focus on the jurisdiction and the limited jurisdiction of each of the agencies. So the FDA is more focused on devices, and there's a lot that falls through the cracks. And so there's not the obligation to look at cumulative effects or across the board, the synergistic effects, which is something that Dr. Moskowitz mentioned.
Can I just quickly just add that something that most people are not aware of in terms of rebutting this issue is that there is no agency that has authority and is actively doing anything related to cell tower radiation, monitoring the levels. That was defunded with the EPA. There isn't anyone checking for impacts to birds, bees, or trees, or assessing any impacts. And this is a critical lack of accountability at the federal level that our elected officials need to be informed about so that they can then champion this issue.
Thank you, Theodora. Question from Anne-Marie Lyles.
And I would take my hand down. I know that, I believe Lendri at least had looked into shareholder advocacy, and I'm wondering that I believe, you know, a year or so ago, it didn't seem like there was a good path for that, but it seems like things have changed a lot now with the lawsuit and additional research. And I wonder if it'd be worth revisiting going after insurance companies and the telecoms by the shareholder route.
So I'd love to speak on that because I've approached As You Sow about that. And again, that was a few years ago, and they were interested, and it was the bandwidth answer where they said, if we had someone to devote time and energy to understanding the science, absolutely, we'd most groups, you know, will play and participate if they have some funding to do it. They were very interested in that. Even going after companies that the wireless baby monitors are so terrible when you look at the levels of what they're emitting. The diapers, there is an EMF diaper that I've been trying to go after, Procter and Gamble. We have, I think, 500 signatures. So yes, As You Sow is ready to do that. They would need some funding to do it. I'm really concerned about EMF levels in electric cars, because EMFs in a metal environment, they bounce off each other, and the levels are much higher than they should be. And there's a group, the Ecology Center in Michigan is ready to test EMF levels in electric cars. And there could be some simple things to shield our exposure as we drive around our electric cars. But again, it's a bandwidth thing. Jonas Philanthropies, my pot within Jonas Philanthropies is really is rather small. So that's why I'm trying to get other funders to, whatever your interest, I could point you to the group that's ready to do it. If it's lobbying or shareholder advocacy or more science.
Yeah.
Can I just add that someone asked about curriculum for students and children, and we developed with the Massachusetts Breast Cancer Prevention group a curriculum for students at every age. And I wanted to, can I get you a link to that to showcase that? And we're also supporting curriculum that's developed for diverse youth through a group near here, and she's doing incredible work that we actually gave funding to. It's really needed. It's just educating our youth.
It looks like Allison asked a question about could there be a pooled fund that funders could invest in and so for due diligence on this issue, and then group decisions could be made on where to disperse that. So
the answer I would say is absolutely yes. And I'd want to pull in EWG and some of the great groups on this call to advise on, it would push everyone to work together in this great way. Now there's everyone sort of stabbing at different elements, but I think there needs to be a more cohesive approach for sure. That would be terrific. And we'd welcome any funders in that arena. Any expertise, even if you're not a funder, if you're with a health agency, or if you represent schools, there's so much that can be done on the advocacy side within larger institutions as well. I also wanted to say in the investment side, there's money now, thank goodness, going to green chemistry. There should be more money going into safe tech as well. And I believe there'll be a growing demand for that. So cell phones that have that are safer, or that Peter is really knows about this space, Wi-Fi that turns on as needed. Americans for Responsible Technology, they've created an invention, it's called the Spider or something, where it comes down from the middle of a classroom and you have Ethernet cables that go out from all directions. So I believe that there's money to be made, and there's power there as well in the investment and the research and development. And I don't know if you want to talk about that at all, Peter.
Yeah, I found that, I think this is an Allison thing too, where she did, was it Safer Made or Made Safe? I can't remember which group. But I mean, some of these problems, they really just sit and stagnate until you have a solution. And no one wants to hear about the whole situation until like, oh, here's, they don't want to know about it until they know what they're supposed to do. And so we need these alternative solutions. We need the safe solutions. I think it's automotive safety is a really good analogy. It's like, we all love cars, but we want them to be safe. And, we didn't have automotive safety to the mid-50s, and now it's a market requirement. And that's what we need to focus on in this field as well. And I'm starting to do that since I was in tech before. It's easier for me, but lots of opportunities and domains for funding, on all sides of this.
So if anyone else has any questions, please feel free. We have another few minutes. And if you would like to follow up with other thoughts and conversation, Lendri and the team at Jonas Philanthropies welcomes any and all feedback. And we will put our emails in the chat for you to contact us directly. And I just want to thank all of the speakers who came today and contributed their time and expertise. I know Lendri has been working on this work and this program for many, many months, and it's really a delight to see it all come to fruition. Lendri, is there anything you want to say to kind of just wrap things up?
Just thank you, and don't worry, we can reduce our exposures. It's not hard. And thank you, everybody, so much for your time. Thank you, presenters. Thanks, everybody. Be well. And reach out to me directly. I put my email in the chat if anyone wants to be connected with any of the speakers today or to talk about this further. Thank you.